Suspension bridges and skyscrapers are marvels of modern engineering. But some of the world's most impressive constructions are hundreds of years old. At the turn of the last century, a discovery was made in South Africa's province, Mpumalanga, and the implications of this discovery would change Africa's history as we know it.
If you travel across the Mpumalanga Escarpment, you'll see that there are thousands and thousands of stone-walled circular structures and stone-wall lines, and those represent a society that was an intensive farming community which built extensively in stone. The stone walling isn't in itself particularly unique in African societies, but what makes them unique is that these are not only stone walled, but they involve massive systems of stone terracing. So that these communities have taken the land and they've remodeled it by building terraces in order to make it more effective farming land. It's the biggest intensive farming site anywhere in southern or eastern Africa.
These settlements were spread from Lydenburg to Carolina and Mpumalanga province, but historians only took notice of them much later from when they were discovered.
They were noticed, from the 19th century onwards, but academics and researchers really started to take them seriously from about 1918 onwards when the first studies were done. Some work was done in the 30s, but they were by and large neglected until the 1950s and 60s, when archaeologists started to do some quite intensive research on them, and established at that point that these were the remnants of African societies that had lived in the area and whose descendants to some extent still lived in the area.
Huge controversy raged as to who built these sites.
But at the same time as you had this academic tradition of research, you had a kind of alternative popular version of research, which took its premise that these were not built by Africans. They couldn't possibly be built by Africans because they were stone-walled. And the mythology of the time in those sections of society was that Africans didn't build in stone, they lived in unchanging tribal communities, and that they were ineffective farmers. None of these notions actually fits the Bokoni sites, but nonetheless became a very powerful view of them.
The Bokoni were a peaceful society, but war was looming all around them.
What happens in South Africa in the late 18th and early 19th century is you have the development of powerful raiding states, which are much more highly militarized than the Khoni were. Perhaps the best known of those is the Zulu kingdom. Now, those states were designed, much more effectively designed for military purposes. They had highly organized regiments. They raided over long distances. Some of those states moved through this area. And they attacked the Khoni communities. They took their grain, they took their cattle, and they seized large numbers of women and children, which were then incorporated into these other societies.
The Bokoni had to flee because of the densely populated settlements that were rich in food, but they did leave something incredible behind.
Yes, well, part of what's remarkable about these sites is that we have the most abundant stone engraving sites anywhere in southern Africa which are connected to these. And what they are, if you look at them, is that they're stones on the ground which have elaborate patterns carved into them. They tend to be circular patterns, and then they're trails that look almost like tails. But in fact, once you look at these sites from the air, and what's being carved on these rocks is images of the settlements and these paths running between them.
Colonial perceptions still try to discredit what was discovered.
From very early on, it was clear to archaeologists and to other social scientists and historians that these were African sites representing an African past. But all over Africa, colonial perceptions of Africa has been that it's a static and unchanging continent. So whenever colonial societies have discovered evidence of a dynamic past, they've tended to assume that this must be the work of outsiders. So everything from the Zimbabwe ruins to the Benin bronzes to the pyramids have tended to be dismissed by this school of thought as non-African and coming from outside.
It shows that African societies were capable innovators and builders of amazing structures. But what have we learned from this?
Part of what it shows is, what's most striking about it is it gives us a window into the way in which African societies lived prior to 1800. And there's a very common assumption that African societies were not very effective farmers. They tended to practice fairly rudimentary forms of agriculture. They were highly mobile, they moved around, they used soil until they had exhausted its potential. Now this completely gives the lie to that set of ideas. These are communities which developed over long periods of time. These stone-walled terrace systems took generations to build, and the agriculture that was practiced within them was long-term and intensive.
One has to wonder if the architects of these great ancient settlements knew the cultural and historical significance that their creations would have on modern history. Marveling at its imposing beauty and learning of the historical events that transpired hundreds of years ago, one can only hope that these structures can endure forever, as they are an important part of human history.